This is where you and I could spend a lot of time, and I don't know how much time you have today to do this. But what's up on the screen here is an analysis of the sublime primordial qualities of the nine chambers and what happens when those qualities are distorted through conceptuality and the attachment to conceptual designations made by Dot. On the left, you see the two trees with an entirely different functional interpretation of the Sphirot. That not only are Chokmah and Bina different, but all of the Sphirot mean different things. Once conceptuality is designating meanings on things and beginnings and ends are asserted and individual concepts and perceptions are amalgamated into networks, you have a conceptualized universe. You have a dot-based universe. It's an entire worldview. That's one aspect of the etheric foam. It's just made of little bubbles. But what happens when that bubble-like vastness of infinite association becomes translucent? Well, then what the fountain of wisdom is talking about comes to life with drops and streams that join and spread and conglomerate. That's a living ether. So the ether is there in both cases as a metaphor. But within that metaphor, you have either a translucent, open, bright, alive quality, or a series of stoppage points where every bit of information forms an impasse. It's like a world of abysses. It's like the abyss concept takes over everything.
Mm.
Do you see the distinction I'm trying to make here?
Yeah. Yeah,
So when
absolutely.
you look at the primordial qualities that I attribute to the nine chambers, you also have to look at their distortions.
Mhm.
And I don't know how much time you want to spend analyzing this, but I could go through every single one with you, and we
Yeah, I
can.
mean, let's do that. What keeps jumping out at me and flashing off of the screen actually, meaning my eye is keeps getting pulled to it, is on the self-liberating tree on the right hand side corresponding to the middle pillar moving up. On in that area where you have the foam of translucent vision, underneath it says vast visionary play of self ornamentation.
Yeah.
How that is an incredible phrase. I'm my mind is trying to figure out what is meant. What is there a way we can elaborate that? Should we go through each one of these qualities before we discuss that?
No, I'll just tell you what that means.
Okay.
Um, there's general and specific phenomena. For example, somebody who's made contemplative breakthroughs can sit in a room with an ordinary person who doesn't give a crap about any of this, and they can agree that they see the world and there's a tree and there's the sky and there you are and here I am. And on a general level, there is a display that everybody can agree on in a general sense, right? That things seem separate from each other, as do places and times and even ideas and feelings and whatnot. That's generally true depending on how you interpret it. But on an individual specific level, the two realities between the two people in the room don't connect at all, and they can't even discuss it. So, what we could say about the foam, the etheric foam, is that the bubbles of the Klipot appear, and they're gonna appear. And we're not trying to make them go away or burst them or destroy them or anything like that. We're not trying to crush the shells to remove the sparks. That's a misconception. But on the specific level of the most intimate part of our own mind, It's a question of how we interpret this foam. Is it translucent? And does what shines through it become the most important thing to us? Or are we merely reacting to the surfaces as they contrast with each other? So, the vast visionary play of self-ornamentation is the idea that the Or Ein Sof creates a kind of an upsurge through the foam. And in its transparency, the vision plays and ornaments itself. And it's actually the Or Ein Sof that is displayed as the bubbles. And they breathe so that the inner and outer distinctions don't create impasses or barriers or opacities, that the whole thing is existentially transparent. Now, that is a form of play that self-ornaments. It presents its own simplicity as infinite complexity. That's the self-ornamentation. And if luminosity is apprehended at the root of Keter, it's all just Ein Sof playing through its own open luminosity, which presents itself to glorify itself as a self-liberating, self-expressing wholeness where there are no beginnings or ends. It's just the continuum at play. It's a vision of the foam that means something totally different than the same appearance being interpreted as a series of claustrophobic bubbles. Same vision, totally different interpretation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's certainly relevant to all of this work. Same vision, different interpretation.
That's right. So the Malkut of the tree on the left is a foam of Klippa networks. And the Malkut of the tree on the right is the vast visionary play of self-ornamentation. But it's the same foam.
Right.
On a general level, everybody agrees. We see the discrete objects. We see the shadows on the cave wall.
Yeah, there you go.
You see, there's the distinction.
So why don't we go through some of the why don't we go through the nine chambers and the qualities?
Yeah. The tendency, okay, first of all, let's talk about why this form is used for the nine chambers. This is the form of the magic square of beina. It's a threefold magic square, which means 3 units vertically, horizontally, and diagonally. And as we know from our study of magic squares, when you draw a threefold square in this way, the number that is constant in each row is 15. Well, 15 is a really interesting number in relation to the tree because 15 is Yud, Hey, Chokmah, Bina. These are the two forces that when you reify them become light and darkness and they obscure the root, as the Fountain of Wisdom tells us. It's also the divine name of Chokmah, Yah, which we have to put up front, that divine name is the primordial wisdom of luminosity and awareness itself. Yah, a very, very important divine name. So obviously this magic square is very special. The magic square is also corresponding generally for most occultists with the Saturnian influence, the limitation force of Saturn. So this is right at that pivot point in Bina between the lamp of darkness, which is infinite possibility, and restriction and limitation. It could go either way because they're bound at the root. So in a sense, Bina is the pivot point where Chokmah can be realized or not, and this opens or closes Keter. You follow me so far?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's an explanation of why the Saturn square, why the threefold square. The other reason why the threefold square is also because perception is always triangulated, that you have seemingly dualistic contrasts meeting at a single point, which becomes the impact of perception. That's the point of impact. So that aspect of triangulation is what opens and closes at the root, right? You with me so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So the tendency with the square is to read it in a linear manner in rows, which generally can be seen as starting in the upper left corner and ending in the lower right corner. But you don't have to read it that way. It's just very convenient for us to go through the qualities that way because they line up logically. There's other ways of doing it. You could actually shuffle around the placement of every single one of these qualities except for the central one. The central one always remains constant. So the first quality, starting in the upper left for the purposes of discussion, is openness. And by saying openness, we're not talking about a void here. We're talking about a possibility expanse that is so full and whole and complete that there is absolutely no reduction possible. It is irreducible. The sum total of all possibility would be exactly the same as awareness having no thing to focus on or think about. What does the mind do when it's not thinking? Well, it's open. It's purely open and possible. The basis of contemplation and all meditation, I should add, is resting in this naturally arising expanse, the pure openness of pure possibility. Now, the real question that we could go into to make our discussion even more complex is how does this relate to the numbers of the magic square and the Hebrew letters attributed to them? I don't think we have time to go through all of that. But the letter, well, the number associated with this point in the square is the number 4, which is the Hebrew letter Dalet. That's a door. It's an open door.
Mm.
What else can we say about it? The next point on the upper row, going from left to right, is this principle of divulgence. And this is where it becomes clear that this is not an emanationist system and is not an emanationist view. Because when some quality or attribute is expressed by that infinite open possibility, it doesn't stop being open. Right? That this openness is so full that it can become anything and everything without ever departing from itself. Well, that's a huge difference from an emanationist system where you have Ein Sof restricting itself and limiting itself to become Keter and then to become Chokmah and then to become Bina and then to cross an abyss to become Chesed, right? An emanationist system allows the divulgence of phenomena to depart from its essential ground. And what I'm saying here is no such thing ever happened. That's a big difference.
Yeah.
Now, when phenomena is divulged from openness and does not ever stop being open, that divulgence forms the basis for all motion and all change. So it's attributed to the Hebrew letter Gimel, the number 3, because that's the motion of the camel. I mean, the camel was the pickup truck of the ancient world, you could say.
Yeah.
It's the mode of transport, it moves.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about an ancient agrarian interpretation of the symbol,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also that which triangulates. It's the number 3.
Mm-hmm.
So openness becomes divulgence without ever ceasing to be open. And that divulgent, open expanse is what resonates infinitely throughout all phenomena. And that's the third aspect of that top row, the resonance of that which appears but yet can't be reduced to any particular appearance, that which is displayed and presents itself, but yet carries with it the open possibility that is never diminished. That's the resonance that is supernally carried actually through Bina. That's that lamp of darkness in a nutshell, is those three qualities in concert with each other. Now that I've explained that top row from left to right, which is the way that we is best to start the explanation, let's cut to the bottom row,
Okay.
like skipping the middle row for the time being.
Right in here.
Yeah. That primordial aspect of a purely open, possibilizing ground is evident through the opening of the consideration of any kind of display. That if a klipa arises, for example, you think a thought, and that thought is itself, it has a defining boundary. Inside of the shell of that mental construct, you could say, is content of some sort. But beyond that shell is everything that is not that content, right? So the way that we reify phenomena is by creating a defining boundary that separates what you're reifying from the whole of everything else. Contemplation is a return to the basic wholeness that reification can't contain, meaning the shell is rendered transparent, and that pure, open, divulgent force breathes through what appears to separate it. You with me so far?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. In that act of contemplation, it is as if every klipa is continually opening in the same moment that it appears closed. So you have a continual state of reality opening itself in its divulgence. That is a primordial quality because that allows that state of openness to be regarded as not static, that it's inherently present in motion, in the assertion of things, in all things. So if we view all things in their presentationality as continually opening, then the openness and the divulgence are always present, right? And create no problem whatsoever. They're primordially pure. Now, what happens as that continual opening is asserted, no matter what arises, is just like the fountain of wisdom says, and just as the Corpus Hermeticum says, all things shine with a radiance that is irrepressible and irreducible. And that is, that radiance, that light, that is the essence of your own awareness. So this is how the top row and the bottom row are joined to each other, because it's not as if the bottom row is a product of the top row. They are the same thing. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the openness and its capacity to divulge itself and to resonate, that is awareness.
Mhm.
That is the Or Ein Sof.
Mhm.
And it's present in the opening of all things that radiate.
Mhm.
Now, if this is understood in wholeness, beyond beginnings or ends, like the Ouroboros with its tail and its mouth, I'd like to say for Yetzirah says, the end is embedded in the beginning, and the beginning is embedded in the end, like a flame in a burning coal. That takes us right to the center of the entire construct, which is spontaneity. That's how phenomena arise without coming from anywhere or going to anywhere. Where is there to come from? Where is there to go to? Right? When you follow the timeline, show me a past, show me a future, and I'll believe that there is one. Until then, it's merely speculative. So what do we have? You can't even freeze the now into a moment.
Mhm.
All we have is the spontaneous upsurge of awareness in self-ornamentation, playing.
Mhm.
And it is primordially pure. That's the right hand aspect. And all pervasive. I mean, that's the left hand aspect, and all pervasive, that's the right hand aspect. So on either side of the middle row, spontaneity is pure and pervasive. And those are naturally occurring sublime qualities. So the whole of the nine chambers is spontaneous beyond time, beyond dimensional location, self arising, self ornamenting, pure luminosity at play.
Wow. Wow.
That's the short answer.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. That's quite incredible. Yeah, and I don't think I've ever seen you lay it out in that much detail, not with me before. And then you've obviously got underneath it the corresponding inversions or
Yeah, when dot is what dot does is it in its creation of approximate constructs, it reduces meanings to small packages that can then be processed and associated together. And by doing that, you obscure the primordial and Keter closes up. And openness becomes obstruction. Divulgence becomes reification. That anytime anything is divulged, it's reified instantly by the habits of the mind. And that's when the infinite resonance becomes just a series of territories or regions. Sometimes it's called regioning, right? Now, the bottom row, where opening is asserted, this is what becomes horribly confused once the mind starts conceptualizing. Because if you were to look at the phenomena of an appearance presenting itself, and in the same moment, that appearance opening to its basic nature, your mind would become dissociated. That the associative network can't hold opening and closing at the same time beyond the opposites. So you'd go into a dissociative state. In other words, you disrupt the associative patterns. Right. So the
hmm
distortion of this concept of realization of opening is dissociation.
hmm
The radiance would also confuse you and you would just end up into an agitated state.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, awareness, because our habit patterns make it perform in such a narrow, constricted little area, it becomes myopic. It becomes a state of myopia, which is a hyperfixation of attachment. That's the Saturnian limitation force taking over utterly and completely. That awareness becomes myopic as consciousness. And pure awareness is not something that the mind can address at all.
Mhm.
That center point of total spontaneity is reduced to what I call thingness, where every piece of phenomena is bounded as a shell in a klipa field. And it becomes a thing. The mind is not a thing. Reality is not a thing. But we interpret it that way,
Right.
and that's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is the starting or one of the starting points of the Platonic where ultimately he moves us towards the divided line in the Republic, which tells us the various degrees of knowing, the highest of which is super discursive. But he begins by dissecting um, in the Cratylus. He begins. So that's the beginning of the what we call the epistemological dialogues, right? The we've explained epistemology already today, but he begins to show how we can move closer to understanding. It starts out with images and then moves on to the discrete objects of which they are copies. The discrete objects being copies of a higher aspect of them, and you move all the way up this hierarchy of knowledge, ultimately landing at the end in its being. Its being, which would is to me is correspondent to awareness, like you're talking about us.
Well, it's in my system, it is the place where awareness is found.
Right. Yeah, because there's an acknowledgement there of something else's existence.
But I do think that you have to break through beingness because you can reify it.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. But the starting place is always in the Platonic Pedia is always in the dissection of or the coming to understand thingness. Not necessarily so that we could sit here like Aristotle and classify and
Yeah.
categorize everything, but you can understand really when you're reading this stuff, what Plato's doing through his, sort of beautified Socrates is saying like, do you see now? Do you see what your mind is doing?
That's amazing that you say that because Plato is the pivot point between the two trees, and the tree of Aristotle is the tree of Dot, and the tree of Socrates is the tree of
Absolutely.
life.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah,
Uh,
100%.
yeah, that's great. That's great. The thingness we apply both to the act of perceiving and to that which is perceived.
Hmm.
And what it is essentially the constrictive or reductive principle,
Hmm.
you know. And once we permeate it to the point that it is rendered transparent, apparent reductions and constrictions are no longer a problem. They can persist. We could see the shadows on the wall of the cave and we're not fooled.
Hmm. Hmm.
So the interesting thing that happens at the root in Keter is we're brought there by being with a capital B, where the presence of consciousness asserts all things, and the sum total of it is the monad.
Hmm.
But if that monistic presence is not rendered transparent so that the quality of reification transcends itself, we will never break through to Or Ein Sof. But once it does, the presence of being can do anything and it becomes self ornamenting play.
Hmm.
You know, this is the difference between a very fine distinction in non dual systems between non dual systems that have a monistic point of view and those that don't.
Hmm.
Because not all non dual systems are saying the same thing.
Right.
You know, and you have, for example, non dual systems that allow duality to arise without there being any problem whatsoever.
Right.
You know, and that's the sign that there's no monism left at all.
Yeah.
Right. And then you have other so-called non-dual systems where the goal is to be like a drop of water that's returned to the ocean. That's a very different view.
Hmm.
So if
And
the ocean is God and you're the drop, that's one model of non-duality, but that's not the one that I'm talking about.
right. That's kind of what my next question was, where do you fall on that
Oh,
spectrum?
I am most definitely in the standpoint of anything can arise, and if transparency is truly realized, there's no problem whatsoever because it's the vast visionary play of self ornamentation.
Wonderfully said. And
Yeah.
worth saying over and over and over again.
Yeah. In other words, there are no obstructions, even though the world seems to be entirely made of them.
Mhm.
Between things and places and times and ideas, and even the difference between being and non being itself ceases to be a problem. Like the idea that there's a dualistic distinction between being and nothingness is itself the root of the problem.
Mhm. Yeah, and this goes some way to understanding things like metaphysical causality and things like theurgy and magic, where it's like, you know, you have a rite or a visualization or something that you perform, and there's an observable effect. Now, in anything in the realm of phenomena, and looking at it through the lens of, physical causality, it's like I push a domino here, and boop boop boop, it goes all the way down to the final domino. When you're doing things like magic and theurgy, you're hitting a domino here, and it seems to be this gap, but this domino over here falls. And what you see a lot of times is, especially in the Renaissance, this this extreme effort to find some sort of metaphysical causality, like some sort of chain, and they use these hypothetical substances and spirits and things of this nature. When I think, the longer that I do this, it's more closely tied to this exact idea that you're talking about. Is there are no obstructions.
Hmm.
You know,
Well, the thing about it is that when you look at the causes and effects from the view that I'm talking about, we're not trying to wipe out the impression that they appear that way. They certainly do. They certainly do appear causal in a linear way. But when you cut to the ground of that causality, you see that the beginning and end of that process are superpositioned.
Mhm.
They can exist in the same instance.
Yeah.
So in that superpositioning, you've just negated what the Sefer Yetzirah says when it says the beginning is embedded in the end and the end is embedded in the beginning, like a flame in a burning coal. I'm not trying to say that the beginning and end are the same. What I'm saying is they have an equal essence.
Right. Alpha and Omega.
That's right. To say that they're the same is a monistic assertion where you're trying to blur the apparent differences between them. Let there be apparent differences.
Mhm.
That's part of the self-ornamenting play. No problem. If the essence is truly understood to shine through that dilemma. And that's what the superpositioned view does, is it takes away attachment to that linearity of the designation of intervals.
Mhm.
And the place where you have to bring this, and this is where I get a little bit controversial here, is to the idea that the root of every theistic system is a prime mover, a first cause. Because once you designate that there's a God that's the first cause, now you have causality, and you're not going to be able to do anything about it. The only way that you could approach it, even if you wanted to, would be pantheism.
Mhm.
So what I do is I always tell people that my view is exactly like pantheism, except without the theism.
Just Pan.
Just well, somebody else already used that, and we don't want to bring him into this.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to the next image.
Okay.
Okay, let's talk about the ether. Let's talk about the ether, which is really what we came here to talk about. So we could say that the foam is a metaphor, which is like the means to realization, depending on what we do with it. It could be the klipa foam of little bubbles, or it could be the self-ornamenting play of translucencies. Still, it's the same foam. It's a matter of interpretation. I give a definition here: luminous space in variation. Right? That's my definition for it. It's very much like the Noga. And that's actually where the Klipa shells are resolved in the glow that they assert. There's something called the Klipa Noga, which is the idea that the shells, although they still appear to be differentiating divisions, they glow.
Mm.
That once you penetrate the first layer of superficiality, there's a glow, which is what the word noga implies. There's a glow that has to be contended with. And the deeper you go into that in between point that is on one side or the other of the shell, the more the shell can be permeated and ultimately outshined. So the ether occupies that in between territory between containment and the uncontainable. It lives in the Noga.
So interesting there, right? Because Noga is also the name of the planet Venus,
Right. And it's associated with Netzach.
and associated with the goddess Aphrodite,
Oh,
who
absolutely.
in Greek that word means Aphros Dita, right? Born from the foam.
That's right.
That's
There you
what that
go.
word. That's what her name
Bingo.
means. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the Klipa Noga
Crazy.
is described a lot by Arya Kaplan in the book Inner Space, and he does a lot with it. But if you think about it, there is nothing about the glowing of shell creation that is not like the mind. That's the place where what is perceived and the perceiving of it, the lines between them are totally blurred, right? And what we call appearance and consciousness just naturally blend with each other. So, one thing that is done when we sink into this vision of the primordial ether is that we allow that blurred distinction between perceiver and perceived to get very fluid and very sort of hazy and indistinct. And we are swallowed by the glowing of that haze. And if we contemplate beautifully there, we could realize the sublime qualities that are present. But we could also get lost there. We could also get lost there. That when you go into the haze, you could just merely become confused and disoriented, and you end up in a stupor-like state, like you just smoked the extremely potent hash extracts that they sell at the dispensary.
Purple haze. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is where we can talk about the thing that I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, the degrees of etheric manifestation, and how the primordial ether is not just a lower astral phenomena, but goes all the way up and all the way down. On the highest level, it's Avir Kadmon, which is essentially the same as Or and Sof. At the middle point, at the point where it hovers on the surface and you intersect the Noga, the glow, you have the Ruach Elohim. You have that undifferentiated atmosphere that becomes the Ruach, becomes the winds of the mind, but it's still pristine enough that it's undifferentiated. It doesn't have any qualities because that would be a differentiation of it, and it's totally undifferentiated. So you could say that the Ruach Elohim is like the in-between point, the point where we perceive habit patterns as solid form in substance and place and time and idea and all of that. On the level of field immersion, and this is something that we have to talk about, like how field immersion is done contemplatively. We have a phenomena that I wrote in a book about this, but not a lot of people read it. There's a point of drop off where radical shifts happen in consciousness from the habit patterns that we think are normal into a total disruption of that system. And what we fall into is what I call black ether. Black ether is the total loss of reference points. It's the total loss of orientation. So you can't get your bearing. And on the one level, it's very liberating. But on another level, it's completely frightening. Because if you don't have a foothold anywhere, you're lost. And the mind will generally go into a panic state once that happens. And if you go into contemplation to merge with the foam and you study it enough to even intellectually understand what this means, and then you actually get good enough as a practitioner to try it, you're going to taste the black ether. And to the extent that you could do that, the black ether is actually purifying you. But you're going to freak out. And it's going to be pretty uncomfortable for the most part. Now, this is what actually prepares you to approach the Ruach Elohim, right? And the Ruach Elohim is ultimately what prepares you to realize the Avir Kadmon. These are successive layers of purification that a practitioner goes through. And this is where, and I don't know even how deeply we can talk about it today because it's such a vast topic, this is where we have to address the Kabbalistic world called the world of points, which is one of the primordial phases associated with Keter. But it also involves Chokhmah and Bina very, very distinctly. When dot is dissolving, you enter into the world of points, which is a field of scintillation. That's field immersion that before it realizes true transparency dissolves into what we call profuse scintillation.
Now, let me ask you this. You talk about these varying levels of purification. In that sort of right, and there's kind of a verticality to it. We constantly have to lean on those that way of
Oh, let
speaking.
me just insert something before you keep going.
Yeah,
The,
please.
the, the verticality is only from the standpoint of our own habits.
Right,
Okay,
right.
let's make that clear. It's not an objectively real thing that we are discovering. We're just unmaking our own habit patterns.
Right, which is what exactly what ties into what I'm going to ask, which is just for a further clarification. We have the same thing in the theurgic ascent, right? So in the idea, particularly according to Iamblichus and Proclus, they say that there are three levels of that ontological chain. The lowest rung consists of purification. The midway, the middle rung is elevation, lifting upward, and then the final is illumination.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of people get caught up in this idea of purification. You know, they're like, it's like when it's. I'm going to date myself so bad, but it's like in the song "Hot for Teacher" when David Lee Roth goes, "I don't feel tardy." You just go like, I don't feel impure. I don't. My soul's not impure. And I was like, so let's cure, because I know that we've already kind of mentioned it before, and I know what you're talking about. But what do you mean? Do we mean when we're talking about purification in this context?
Gross attachment. We're talking about two things. On the one hand, we're talking about the reification of an object that appears totally separate, totally solid, totally distinct from everything else. And at the same time, you as the knower appear totally separate and distinct in the act of knowing the object. So the more the subject and the object are reified, the more separate they seem, the more utterly different they are interpreted. And the world is just made of a bunch of pieces based off of that paradigm. So that's the condition of gross fixation. And what purification is the alleviation of that separateness of both knowing and a thing being known. And the more they blend together, the more purification takes root. And of course, this is a matter of degree. That's why it's purification, because you could do it a little or you could do it a lot. If you do it a lot, then you're a conventionally fixated, normal human being. If you do it a little, then you're a practitioner. If you don't do it at all, you're a tzaddik, you're a saint.
Mm,
And I'm no saint, so I can't tell you what that's like. But as
yeah.
a practitioner, I go in and out of degrees of this all day. That's my life.
Yep. Yeah, I'm no saint either.
Yeah, so I can't tell you what stable realization is like, because then you'd be a Buddha, a Christ, you'd be, a perfected being. And
Could you even tell it if you had it? Is it something tellable? I don't know.
well, we have these great figures throughout history who spoke through that state and left writings. And whether they're metaphoric or whether we believe them or take them literally is another issue altogether. You have to take that on a case by case basis. But we could say that, leaving that issue aside, one can become so very, very good at this that the purification really does take you to that next level and ultimately to illumination itself, as you expressed. So, yes, I think purification is a very real thing that happens, because I know that when I started practicing, I was dualistically fixating my attachments in a more gross manner than I am now. And I've made progress, and I could see that progress. So, obviously, there is a degree shift
Mhm.
that has proven itself to be real.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, it ties back to what we were saying before, the removal of obstruction, the clarity that comes with
Yes.
that it has to precede insight.
Well, clarity, if it's truly open and divulgent, like we said before at the same time,
Mhm.
is freedom.
Yeah. Yes. That's the whole, oh God, that's amazing. That's the whole deal with something like theurgic Neoplatonism is freedom.
Yeah.
When you are bound to the illusory nature of the body being foremost and its interaction with everything, you have less freedom. That's why there was this emphasis in theurgic Neoplatonism of something like Iamblichus. He's just like, yeah, I don't give a shit about using astrology to divine the future, because that to them was their kind of like, everything below that was in this really deterministic sphere. It's like, our job is to get above that deterministic weather, and this is the way, which is, you listening to what you have to say about the approach of this stuff will, for anybody that's listening, this conversation, and anytime David really talks about any of this stuff, if you are interested in theurgy and you're interested in whether that's antique theurgy or modern theurgy, it's couched in all these technical terms and all this kind of stuff that it are they're at greater than arm's length from us. These things were coined and used in an archaic time that we no longer understand. And we can't really understand it fully. So to hear you talk about this stuff, it's like, I don't know, opening something that was formerly encased. And you're having all this to try and figure out what's on the inside of this thing by judging by the wrappings. That's what it can feel like a lot of times when you're working in this, you're looking at these ancient texts and then the translations. So to listen to you speak about this stuff is like opening the box. We can see it now. We see how it's done.
Well, not every lineage passed with the vicissitudes of history. I mean, quite a few lineages carried these views as practice to this day in an unbroken line, in a bunch of contexts. And some of them didn't. Some of them died out, and we have the fragments that they left us, the artifacts. And we are forced to take the sum total of it and try to put it together again. But the possibility that we could accomplish exactly what we're talking about is just as real now as it was in late antiquity, you know. And I uh, operate my practice from the standpoint that this is for real and the stakes are as high as they could possibly be, which is, the use of your life. And there's enough meat on the bone of what appears to be a half dead or half living carcass that you could make sense of it, And this is where the metaphor of the foam ceases to be theoretical and really comes to life, because it's the flesh of reality. That, remember, in the very beginning of our conversation, we were talking about myth and how myth is like an in between point, a twilight point between form and formlessness. Well, that's what the foam is. The foam is the tissue of living myth, where imagery becomes the intersection point. That's fountain of wisdom.
Wow. Yeah. That's powerful. That's an
Yeah.
incredible quote.
And take what I just said literally.
Hmm.
And I'll give you an example, because I'm just speaking off the top of my head here, right? Like, I never actually even said that before. I just thought of it just now. but the thing of it is, it's actually true, because take geometry, for example. All of geometry starts at a point, right? And then lines are drawn and the lines intersect, and they could be straight, they could be circular, whatever they are. But the model for the construct that we're talking about is a point designating the assertion of phenomena that is encapsulated in the echoing skin of its context, which becomes the periphery or circle around that point, the point within the circle. You with me so far?
Yeah.
This is where Pike got it from. You know, the point within the circle, the working model of reality. What I'm asserting in my acausal view of transparency is that the two outshine their separation, that the point becomes the model, symbolic model, for the spark of awareness when the mind wakes up to the instance of its perception before it starts modifying and conceptualizing and doing whatever it does to fuck itself up. The point of instant awakening, at the sudden instance of assertion, is a spark of absolute purity that is naked. My statement to you and to everybody else is you have nothing to lose by regarding that spark as the assertion of Or and Sof. As if Or and Sof was not some faraway thing that you'll never reach. It is right there in the heart of your own mind, in the instance of its assertion. However, when you reach to grab it, it's gone. That's meditation.
Yeah. 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 That's also how I know that the universe or whatever this is has some sense of humor. You know?
So when that instance of absolute freedom arises as your own awareness, we fuck it up by turning it into a separate moment in a chain of moments that unfold in a linear way. Right? What happens then is the horizon that echoes out from that point becomes a circular shell around it that designates its context. In other words, it begins and ends. And then you have a finite thing. Then you have a causal chain that's bounded by time. Okay? What I'm suggesting is that there is a depth of meaning where the points and peripheries share an essentiality so utterly and completely that they agitate each other to the point that they spill out and open and become the space in which they sit. And that's the entrance point into what I call the bath of scintillation. That's where the field immersion has purified itself of its gross level distinctions, and now you live in the twilight of the ether.
Wow. 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 Now,
That's known as the world of points.
mhm. Now you've let's clarify a little bit the term of the term used in there, field, because I've heard you talk about your the way that you approach um, these things, and actually I've come to sort of adopt that understanding into my own viewpoint. But you talk about encountering things as textured fields.
Yeah.
You've said that one or two times to me, I think on, off the record, and that is a really fascinating thing. I mean, is this does that usage of it, your description of that, does that tie into what you're talking about here in terms of field immersion?
Yeah, when the ruach perceives on subtle levels, and when you enter, for example, into a place where points and peripheries start to enter into that glow, where they're not so separate from each other, but yet they still appear separately, and they oscillate between degrees of separation and degrees of reification, the middle zone that we're talking about of the Noga. What happens is that the space in which the Ruach moves is an infinite space. It's not contained anywhere. It's totally open, but yet is teeming with activity. So it's an infinite perceptual field. And when I use the term field, or immersion into the field, or field immersion, I'm really talking about the performance of the Ruach, where it's not located anywhere. You can't nail it down to a point in matter or in space or in time, and you can't even idealize it because conceptualizing about it, thinking about it will close it up. So it's got to be not conceptual, not non conceptual, but semi conceptual, where it becomes open and permeable and assumes sensations that's what I refer to as textures. I call it psychoetheric texturing. It's a term I use for it because it's psychoetheric. It's not as if the ether was separate apart from your perceiving it. It's a result of how you're perceiving.
Mm-hmm.
However, your perceiving is no longer limited to physical brain activity.
Right. Mm.
So it's not merely within you, and it's not outside of you either.
Yep. Yeah. That's one of the things that, it's hard to inculcate in people this idea of we talk about it in terms of the microcosm and the macrocosm and how they're kind of related to each other, which is well not kind of, but absolutely inextricably linked to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's the things, because that's a constant thing that always comes up. Are spirits and angels and demons, do they have an objective reality, or are they just things inside of us? And it's like, well, both at the same
Or
time.
neither.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
At a certain point, yes, neither, because you realize that there's no difference between the exterior and the
Yeah,
interior.
it's a false distinction.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Robert Flood has this great diagram at in the beginning of I think it's history of the macrocosm. I forget which Robert Flood book it is, but he shows two triangles back to back, and he's basically saying, well, it's one single triangle. They appear as microcosm and macrocosm, but that's a distinction which is for our benefit only. In reality, it's all the divine.
Yeah, I've got the book right here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there's the Adam McLean
Yeah,
version. Yeah, right in the beginning, there's the two triangles back to back.
yeah. Yeah, an incredible text, and you put me on to it, and
Yeah, Flood's awesome.
yeah.
However, he was a theist, and he has some dualistic assertions in there that I don't agree with, but that doesn't take away from the breakthroughs that he makes.
Mhm.
I mean, he was a theist with a capital T.
Oh yeah.
I mean, he was a ruffled shirt, old time theist dude.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, it's important for what it is. But what I'm saying about the foam, where the point and the periphery dissolve their distinctions, those distinctions can still be asserted once you purify out the belief that they are separate. And that's the point that I'm making. We're not trying to wipe out the difference between microcosm and macrocosm. Things can appear microcosmically or macrocosmically, no problem, as long as we could see through, literally see through in transparency at the root. Then we're not going to reify any of it. The reification is not even a problem. It's the belief in the
Yeah,
reification, the problem.
exactly. The amount of investment
Yeah,
that we put into these things. We
that's the definition of habit.
yeah, we and this is the whole thing. It's just kind of like, okay, don't put all your eggs in that basket, in the materialist
Yeah,
basket.
the basket of conventional reality.
Yeah, exactly.
There
Which is
is no such thing as conventional reality.
Well, I mean, there's a reification of there's a perception of conventional reality, and I think that's one of the reasons why you get great people like the Buddha, like Christ, like even at Socrates. Their entire message is sort of people scratching their heads at it because it's almost everything that they're saying contradicts what we would consider worldly wisdom, common sense.
Well, what happened to each and every one of those figures when they started saying this in public? Well,
Not good.
not good.